perpetuated by all the political parties and their media allies, and has had real resonance so far amongst the majority of the British population. So how has this come about? It's important to argue against the increasingly widespread view that these policies simply result from the right-wing ideology of the Conservative Party. In fact, the policies of the Condemn coalition are a continuation of the process set in motion by the previous Labour government. Just as the Labour government began the attack on the public sector in the mid-1970s and laid the ground for Margaret Thatcher's neoliberal counter-revolution, so the Labour government's planned deficit reduction in its pre-election March budget in 2010 opened the way for the Condemn's coalition programme to dismantle and privatise state welfare over the next Parliament. It was the Labour Prime Minister James Callaghan who told the Labour Party conference in 1976, "We must get back to fundamentals. We used to think you could spend your way out of the recession and increase employment by cutting taxes and boosting government spending. I tell you, in all honesty," the Labour Prime Minister said, "that option no longer exists." And that government opened the way to Thatcherism by complying with the conditions of an IMF loan to defend the pound. It set monetary targets and cut public spending and wages. In the third week of 2010, the then Labour Chancellor Alistair Darling told the Financial Times that he will order his ministers to start work on the most swinging cuts in public spending in a generation. Halving the public sector deficit in 4 years, he said, was non-negotiable. This was confirmed in his March budget. For the Labour Party, as for any ruling class party in power in this country, and this is a critical point, the interests of the international markets, the financial services sector, and the City of London are the unquestionable priorities. It should be no surprise that the Condemn coalition felt confident enough on coming to power to slash state welfare and public spending even further than the cuts that was planned by the Labour government. At the end of August 2009, and I'm going to go through this process, how this all came about, the head of the Financial Services Authority, Lord Turner, a former banker, described some of the innovative activities of the City of London, such as credit default swaps, as socially useless. He said that the financial services sector had grown beyond a socially reasonable size, and the City had become a destabilising factor in the British economy. These were dangerous thoughts, given the importance of financial services and the City to British capitalism, and the then Labour government's priority that the City of London remain a centre of world finance, the financial arm of British imperialism. Lord Turner's remarks were very quickly drowned out by an ideological assault on the public sector, directed at this stage not at public services as such, for which there is massive public support throughout the country, but at unsustainable public sector borrowing. Suddenly, the most dangerous threat to the British economy was not the bloated financial sector, but the debt of the public sector. It's happened in a very short period of time, in fact 2 weeks. This was given ideological expression through an orchestrated campaign in the media, with politicians of all persuasions rapidly and willingly following this lead. What followed was almost a public auction by the main political parties over the cuts in public spending necessary to tackle the unsustainable public sector deficit. The main difference then between the Labour and Conservative parties resolved essentially around the starting date of the cuts, with Labour arguing in its March 2010 budget that cutting too soon before April 2011 would drive the economy back into recession, and the Conservatives insisting on immediate deficit reduction to retain the confidence of the financial markets. So powerful, however, was the ideological offensive on public sector borrowing that Ipsos Mori, a market research company, was able to report that while in March 2010 the number opposing Conservative strategy was double those in favour of it, by the end of June this had radically changed, with 44% backing swift deficit reduction and 35% against. A massive swing, and it's significant how powerful the ideological assault of the ruling class and its media allies had actually been on the British population. Never ever underestimate this. They paved the way for their policies, for their class policies. Now it's necessary to counter this ideological offensive against state spending. In this context, it's important to restate some fundamental points about financial capital and British capitalism. The massively increased role of financial capital, increasing speculation, and the ever-expanding credit bubble built on a relatively declining productive base, which were the forerunners of the crisis, were the results of an over-accumulation of capital in the heartlands of capitalism. And what does that mean, over-accumulation of capital? It means that capital exists, there is surplus capital, there still is surplus capital, but it's not being invested because the return on that capital is inadequate. It's actually being stored. It's not being utilised. And in fact, that's still the case. After this whole period of crisis, don't think there's a shortage of capital. In Europe, there's something like £500 billion of capital, which is held by 466 multinational corporations. And in fact, I read in an extract of Gordon Brown's book, his latest book, Beyond the Crash, I think it's called, that in fact, in the developed world, right, in the main capitalist countries, there's over 3 trillion, that's $3,000 billion surplus capital, which is not being invested. Now don't tell me there isn't a crisis of the capitalist system. That's what we call a crisis of the overaccumulation of capital. Financialisation, it might be a word you will have heard, especially if you're in an institution like the London School of Economics. It's a fashionable terminology. It's the product of the crisis of profitability in the capitalist system, the lack of profitable investment opportunities for capital. The expansion of the financial sector, and this is critically important, does not produce any additional value, but appropriates, plunders a greater and greater proportion of the value produced by the productive sectors of economies throughout the world. In fact, there's been a crisis of the capitalist system building up since the 1980s. In fact, we could talk about a continual crisis. I'm not going to go into all this, but I'll remind you the Latin American debt crisis of the 1980s, the 1990s East Asia crisis, Brazil, the crisis of Brazil, in Russia, the 2000 Argentina default, the dot-com crash, and then the financial crash of 2000 and the autumn of 2007. Continual crisis since the 1980s, which has not been resolved.